Good morning. I'm Sally Humphreys, Director of International Development Studies here at the University of Guelph, and I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Spencer Henson. We are truly fortunate to have Spencer Henson here as a faculty member at the University of Guelph. He is an applied economist in the Department of Food and Agriculture Resource Economics with an extraordinary wealth of experience in the field of international development. He has undertaken research across 40 countries, although his specialization is in sub-Saharan Africa. Internationally, he is recognized as an expert on food standards. His specific interest is on food, diet, and health. As a sideline, he has been looking at public support for development in high-income countries. A paper from the study of public opinion in the UK entitled "A Mile Wide, an Inch Deep, Understanding Support for Aid" sums up those findings. He has a host of publications in international development journals, including World Development, as well as with international development institutions such as the World Bank. Spencer has been working for the past 3 years at the Institute for Development Studies in the United Kingdom. He is currently on a leave of absence from the University of Guelph and is working at IDS, where he is the leader of the globalization team. Spencer is going to talk today about his research dealing with the integration of food and nutrition, and we are delighted to have you here, Spencer. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sally. I always wear bright ties when I'm presenting because it distracts people from the content. I normally walk around a lot when I'm talking, but there are a lot of obstacles here, so I would try and not fall over, okay? Is this the thing you were using?
That's the thing, and that's the right button.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, I come at the issue of integrating agriculture and nutrition from somebody who's spent a lot of time working on a whole variety of issues, but examining particularly the way in which agri-food value chains work. That could be about smallholders linking into international markets or local markets and the impacts of things like food safety standards, or in this case, issues to do with linking agriculture through to nutrition. And in the middle, of course, is what people put in their mouths. And we've been working on this now for a couple of 3 years. It's been an interesting endeavor because we've been working with a donor, the world's biggest, USAID. That's been challenging and very interesting. I'll explain some of the reason why in a minute. With one of the organizations that's actively involved in attempts to integrate agricultural nutrition, which is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and various people at IDS. And yes, it's very fascinating to have someone like Robert Chambers as a colleague. If you don't know who Robert Chambers is, just look him up. He's a fascinating individual. Okay. What I'm going to do is give you a bit of background, obviously, talk a little bit about agricultural nutrition in terms of some of the key questions and problems, and then talk about the routes, the potential routes through which agriculture may lead to improved nutrition. And we've been very interested in actually identifying practically ways in which the two can be better aligned with one another. So it has very much a very practical focus because some of the questions that we've been posed, for example, by USAID is, how can we do this better? So the idea is that our sort of more academic endeavors are supposed to actually inform practice in an organization like USAID, and I think they have found it infinitely more complicated and difficult for as much for internal institutional reasons as anything else than they actually expected. Okay, so a bit of background. Why? I mean, undoubtedly, this is one of the big things on the agenda, and I'll give you one of the pieces of evidence for that in a minute. And the reason is that John showed that wonderful chart of rates of undernutrition sort of collapsing up to about 20 years ago. And then now they've sort of stuck. So we have a lot of persistent rates of undernourishment in the world, and then increasing concern about what people now call this hidden undernutrition. And there are always these buzzwords in development, and so now it's hidden undernutrition. And so you can draw in always nice graphs, can't you? And you could show this actually is quite a big change, but if you actually show it as it really is, it's really been stuck in terms of rates of undernourishment. They go up and down. We don't really know how many people are undernourished. These are sort of FAO's best guesses, and they've admitted recently they got it quite wrong. But the numbers are big, and they're not changing very much. And the problem, at least for the donors here, is that they signed up to the Millennium Development Goals, and these things are not supposed to be like this. And these things are supposed to have come down significantly. And so politically, this is embarrassing, and also you're going to begin to see the mud flying as to why this is the case. And we have things like stunting, where particularly in parts of Asia, but also elsewhere, we have very high rates of stunting in children. So Nepal and India, Bangladesh, countries like this, approaching 50%, which is another of the big shocks and another of the big concerns. And this map's had quite a big airing here. These are WHO's best guesses, or estimates, of rates of anemia in the world, and these are for preschool children. And the red means really high, above 40% rates of anemia. So there are a lot of concerns on the nutritional front. Agriculture, I'm not saying it's ever went away, but it's certainly very much back on the agenda now. There's, obviously the global food crisis, which sees agriculture, or sees the food crisis and undernutrition very much as a production or a supply issue, which, as John said, there's a lot more to it, and I certainly agree with that. There's the failure to meet the MDGs on undernutrition, etc. So there's a lot of resource being piled into agriculture. And from that, relatively recently actually, a lot of focus on how we can make that link to nutrition. We have all these problems. We have issues to do with people engaged in agriculture and their incomes, to do with the supply of food. And people say, surely agriculture must play a fundamental role in helping to solve these problems, as basically is key to enhanced nutrition. But at the same time, there is recognition of pretty much wide-scale failure to really integrate agriculture and nutrition. That doesn't mean there haven't been a lot of efforts. There have. But pretty much they haven't worked that well. Now, you're working in a really sexy area when, the development brands come out, okay? And so, we have organizations with off-the-shelf solutions. We have coalitions like Scaling Up Nutrition. We have, Harvest Plus, which IFPRI, for example, is involved with. And all of them have very laudable approaches. It's very easy to get caught up in them, and we're trying not to get too caught up in GAIN, which is one of our partners. And they're all competing for funds. They're all basically selling their wares around the donors. They're not so good at sort of reflecting on what they do and reflecting on how successful they've been. And I think most of these actually offer a lot more than they've actually delivered. You have to offer a lot to be able to pull in funding, but that doesn't mean they couldn't work a lot better, but it does mean that we have to really look down at what really matters in terms of agriculture and nutrition. What I'm going to do before go on to the roots, so that what linkages exist and how we might enhance those linkages. First of all, some sort of questions, and there's certainly problems in terms of agriculture and nutrition. Whoops. Good job I don't need these. The first is, and probably the most fundamental one, how do we integrate these things? Because in principle, it should be quite simple. But of course, the world is far from simple. And you talked about institutions. And we've sort of at least stereotypically, talked about a sort of agriculture world and a nutrition world. And so in a typical country, you have a Minister of Agriculture. They're interested in crops and livestock. They're interested in farm households. They're typically interested in how much food there is, quantity, and maybe a bit about availability, but they live in this world of agriculture. In the international system, there are organisations like FAO. In USAID, there are the parts of their programme that deal with agriculture. Then, often in another building, certainly on another floor of a building, there will be a Ministry of Health. Okay? People in health talk about, or particularly nutritionists, talk about nutrients. They talk about life cycle groups. So, for example, the whole 1,000-day concept of, lactating and pregnant women and infants under the age of 2. And they certainly talk about individuals, often more than households. They're interested in nutritional quality, and they're interested in access to food. Okay, and so in all these different institutions, you have very different worlds. They don't really talk to one another. They use different languages. They make different assumptions. And in bringing together agriculture and nutrition, this is one of the most fundamental challenges, is that the world is carved up in this particular way. Secondly, okay, maybe we can begin to get over some of those problems, and there are certainly efforts to try and do that. But then how do we better align priorities? How do we basically bring together what agriculture is trying to achieve and nutrition is trying to achieve? And in particular, how do we overcome some of the fundamental trade-offs that there are there? I mean, I've sat in meetings where, they often are on different sides of the table, the agriculture people and the nutrition people, and they're sort of talking at one another. And they can talk for a while, but then they actually realise they're talking about different things. For a nutritionist, it's anathema to sort of think about starting with food commodities and agricultural production. For them, you start with nutrition. You want to know what are people deficient in. And then you look at the best ways of alleviating that deficiency. For agriculture, it's, well, what can we produce well? What is going to boost the incomes of farmers? And then we want consumers because we want to be able to sell the stuff. Okay, but we may not be particularly interested in who those consumers are, as long as they've got the cash to be able to buy the stuff that we're producing. And so those worlds are very different, and bringing those together is also a challenge. And there are some fundamental trade-offs there, which I'll come to almost towards the end, that I think are very, very challenging. When you actually get on the ground, so you're actually talking to people who are implementing agriculture interventions or nutrition interventions. And then there's the question of, well, how do we do it? How can we enhance the nutritional outcomes of agriculture? And I think part of the problem here, and it's got wrapped up in all of the issue. I mean, Stephen Lewis yesterday talked about outcomes and impacts, etc. We're in a world, I think, that is very challenging in terms of the standard of evidence that is being accepted. And if you apply the fairly tough standards of evidence in terms of impacts today, there's actually very little evidence about the effectiveness of a lot of interventions that aim to integrate agriculture and nutrition. And I'll come back to that in a minute. It's creating a lot of challenges for donors. So what are the routes? So how can this be achieved? The first one is the one the economists love. Okay, and I'm an economist, and you're halfway there. You're doing well. You've obviously been well trained at IFPRI. I'm not sure I could sound like a vet, but you sound... Anyway. One is basically the agriculture as a macro driver of the economy. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Then there's the sort of more direct intervention stuff, one of which is working with producer households. That's the sort of thing that most agricultural interventions do. They actually work with farm households. And then there is getting this impact out to the rest of the population, which might include farmers who are buying something that somebody else produces, because in that interface they're a non-producer, okay? But it's also all the people in the cities, okay, who need to buy nutritious food at an affordable price, okay? So there are these three sort of potential routes. Now, of course, I'm going to look at the first one, and that's the one that the economists jump onto, because if you say to them, well, why are people undernourished, and how do you improve rates of nutrition and reduce rates of undernutrition, they'll say it's all about income, stupid. Okay? Basically, it's an issue of poverty. That is, that we know in a lot of the poor countries that agriculture is a key economic driver, a lot of people employed there, and that all we've got to do is to put in place the conditions to get agriculture working, and that will then feed through to people having higher incomes, better access to nutritious food, and then everything will all be great. Okay? The trouble is that with processes of development, the importance of agriculture diminishes, and once economic development gets going, it actually diminishes quite rapidly. Often the importance of farm incomes is overestimated. Off-farm incomes are often very important in rural areas, and a lot of farm households that we always assume were subsistence are often far from subsistence in terms of where they get large chunks of the food that they consume. And anyway, there's an incredible weak link between income growth and nutritional outcomes. And so now a lot of economists have been sort of, reflecting again on this as a particular approach. To give you an example, India. So this shows you in India what's happened to agricultural value added, so that's its economic contribution since the 1960s through to sort of round about now, and you can see that agriculture's contribution to the economy has declined significantly. It's still important, and it doesn't mean it isn't important for example, people's livelihoods, the livelihoods of the poor, but actually as an economic driver, it's diminished significantly. So its macro contribution has declined appreciably. Even if it's big, okay, what impact does that have on nutrition? There are a lot of economists have spent time pondering this question and doing a lot of analysis. It's very challenging in parts of the world where data is often very poor. But even if we take agriculture as being important in terms of driving income, what we know is that increased incomes actually lead to, yes, improvements in nutrient intake, but not as great as we think, even amongst the undernourished and very poor. Okay, so for example, Angus Deaton, who's worked a lot in this area, has estimated that, let's assume, just stereotypically, that incomes go up 1%, that leads to probably something like a 0.66, about 2/3 of it gets spent on food. The rest goes on something else, even amongst the undernourished. That then leads to about a 0.5% increase in food intake, that's energy. The rest goes into more expensive calories. We're not too sure about the impacts on micronutrients. It tends to depend on the micronutrients, etc. But certainly, it's far from a one-to-one relationship. Okay, and so that is a very, very important finding in terms of claims that income is going to lead to improved nutrition. So not surprising. This is what's happened in India. From 1998 to 2008, on the income per capita front, very positive, it's about doubled. Rates of poverty have come down about 22%, but look at rates of undernourishment, stunting, anemia, they've come down only by between 6 to 8%. And so, yes, people are less poor on average, but rates of undernutrition have come down a bit, but certainly not in line with growth in income and reductions in poverty rates. So, that's the first one. And what we find there is a very weak relationship. So don't rely on agriculture and boosting income to bring about improvements in nutrition. Something else has to be done. Then we go to the second strategy. That is, we work with producer households. This is what agricultural interventions do, and a lot of them are very good at it. Okay, they work with farm households. They boost productivity. They focus on linking farmers into markets, whether locally or globally, and so on. And so, for a lot of agricultural interventions, this is the first place, the obvious place for them that they look. Okay, and what they do is they look at how they might boost even more farm income. They look at refocusing what they do towards nutrient-dense foods, which will, the supply of which will be enhanced in the household, and then basically, at least amongst some, it's assumed that people will eat this stuff, or they'll spend any additional income that they have in a way that improves nutrition. That then takes us, of course, back to the previous route, exactly what we've just been talking about. It's very easy, well, long as you can work out how to do arrows, etc. In PowerPoint, it's relatively easy to sketch out, which is actually not so easy, but anyway, to sketch out the ways in which agriculture may impact health status, nutritional status in farm households. We can change agricultural production practices, we change what they produce, and they may consume some of it, we boost their income, we presume some of it may be spent on food, and that gets to consumption. We may change labour use patterns, gender balances in terms of labour. That may have impacts on nutritional requirements, and all this sort of nice flow diagram. Of course, examining that in practice is incredibly difficult and very imperfectly understood. But the sorts of interventions that are used by, as agricultural approaches have tried to integrate nutrition are things like, biofortification. So we can basically try and improve the nutrient content, particularly the micronutrient content of staple foods, for example, so that if the farm household consumes them, they're not just getting more calories, they're also getting better quality protein. They're getting more vitamin A or whatever else it is. Okay, so we can, agriculture people like this because it's all about agronomy, it's all about, adoption of new varieties, etc. And they're happy with this because this is what they do. Okay? We can promote kitchen gardens. Everyone loves kitchen gardens because what we can do is we can get people to grow fruits and vegetables, etc., alongside the thing that they're also producing, and that's good because they have access on their own farm household within the community, actually to nutrient-dense foods. And then, maybe reluctantly, we have to bring in the health and nutrition people because we actually have to try and get people to change their behaviour. And of course, as you said, that's the difficult bit. Understanding people's choices. Why do undernourished people who don't take in enough calories, when their income goes up 1%, only spend 2/3 of that on food? It's very difficult to understand. But basically, behavioural change communication is another thing that comes in, and that's where we begin to integrate agriculture and nutrition. The trouble is, converting these agricultural outcomes, the things that a lot of interventions are good at doing, into nutritional outcomes is very difficult. And the evidence of their impacts is not very strong. There's a very interesting story here. The Department for International Development in the UK commissioned the Institute of Development Studies to do a systematic review of the impact on child nutrition of agricultural interventions. And they did this wide-ranging study. Looked at lots and lots of interventions and looked at the ones that had done some analysis, etc. What they did was apply a standard of proof, if you like, which was really pretty strict. It was the one that DFID is really trying to apply. They found 4 studies that could demonstrate an impact according to that standard of evidence. Their conclusion is there is almost no evidence. Okay? Why? Because most of the time those studies haven't been done. They're incredibly expensive to do. They're very difficult to do. They may imply changes in the very way in which you actually implement interventions. And I think that is creating some tensions within the development community. DFID itself is certainly reflecting on the standards of proof that it might apply, because it's quite clear that in many cases they just don't exist. But if you apply that, then you do end up inevitably with a lot of very questionable evidence. Then there's the third route. I think this is the one that is most important. It's the one that is most difficult. It's the one that most interventions have still only dabbled with. That is, how do you get the output from agriculture to people who are nutritionally deficient, in a way that they can afford to buy it, that they'll eat it, that it's actually available to them. It's incredibly difficult, but it is going to become the most important, and in many parts of the world, it is the most important. This just shows you the difference between low-income, lower middle-income, and upper-middle-income countries, so collectively what are called developing countries. You speak to most people in the street, and they'll tell you that pretty much all of the people who are hungry in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa because they've seen it on the TV, so it's got to be right. That isn't true. Recently, there's been some very important work done, which talks about the other bottom billion. It's a sort of play on Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion. What do we find is actually most of the world's undernourished are actually middle-income countries. They're not in low-income countries. And they're in countries where actually the role of agriculture economically is in decline quite rapidly, and agricultural employment is in decline quite rapidly. So what do we see here? You've got even, sort of roughly half-ish are in countries where agriculture's contribution in terms of value added is only 16%. And a big chunk of people employed in agriculture, but an awful lot are not. And those who are not are associated with the route that we're talking about here. That is, getting food from farmers through to people who are undernourished. Okay? And that, I think, is going to be fundamentally, the challenge. What it means is that we have to focus on, if you're in agriculture, it's not good enough that you just sell what you produce. You've got to focus on who do you aim to get it to. Will they be able to consume enough of it? Are they nutritionally deficient in the things that these particular foods supply? And how do you get it to them? Okay, it's not enough to just think about selling it at the farm gate or to some intermediary and it just disappears somewhere along the value chain. And of course, this is where we come in because of our interest in value chains. And so there's a lot of focus on getting those value chains to work well. Now, a lot of agricultural interventions are actually implemented nowadays within a value chain framework. That is, at least there is a focus on the fact that you've got to sell this stuff when it's actually produced. Okay, but there's not a lot of focus in terms of those value chains in a nutritional sense. Are the people who are actually consuming the food that we're producing, whatever it is, are they nutritionally deficient? Are they undernourished? Are they anemic? Whatever else it is. But a lot of focus has to be given to linkages, post-harvest losses, issue to do with nutritional degradation or even enhancement within the value chain, and the transaction costs along the value chain, that basically does the price paid by the poor bear very little resemblance to the price that the farmer actually got. And it requires an entire value chain approach, which I'll come to in a minute. And again, you can draw one of those diagrams once you've got the arrows working, and you've got agricultural production practices, and then we're looking at how do we get it through to people who are nutritionally deficient. And there are essentially two major routes. One is the social protection route. That is, can we sell it to the World Food Programme or UNICEF or whatever, or can we put it through a school milk programme, whatever. Relatively, less difficult to do. Often those supply chains are already there. The value chains are already there. You have a buyer with funds, etc., and actually directed at people who are undernourished. Typically, they tend to be acutely undernourished. They're often people, for example, who are HIV positive, etc. But that's one route. The more important one is the food purchases. That's how most of the poor who don't produce their own food get their food. They buy it. Okay? Predominantly in the informal sector, which creates even more challenges, but they buy food. Okay, and that is the one that we have to get working right. The challenge is this bit here, the nature and performance of the value chain. That is the thing we have to understand. So what we have to... I'll come to that in a minute. We have to understand that, and we can only understand the impacts of the interventions that we might apply if we understand that. Now, the sort of things we might do... We may still do biofortification, okay? Now we're not just interested in it being consumed by farm households, but by the poor somewhere, okay? We might, again, bring in people who try and provide nutrition education, health promotion, etc., either at the level of food consumption or at food purchases. We may try and intervene in value chains to get them working better, okay? Or we may try and ignore agriculture and fortify. That is, we'll chuck some nutrient into it a bit further up the value chain. In principle, it's a lot easier. It's not so easy when you have an informal food sector, but, you know, it's easier than dealing with agriculture because you can just chuck it in. You can even measure the amount you put in. You can control it, etc. So all of these strategies are being used by these various interventions with those nice logos. The trouble is, so often we don't understand what is in this box. As I said, we need to apply a total value chain approach. That is, we've got to apply the analysis from the inputs going into the farmers right up to the stuff that people are putting in their mouths in the cooked form, okay? Not the prepared form. So we have to look at all the interlinkages, because at any stage in that value chain, okay, because of often the tight interconnections between them, you can fall down, okay? And you see this in so many different interventions. Interventions have got it right, interventions have done a good job, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute, actually are quite effective. Those that haven't taken these challenges seriously really struggle, and I'm also going to give you a couple examples of those. But you do have to understand what is going on. Now, I'm a bit nervous, because my example is dairy in Kenya. So do you want to just go out for a couple of minutes? We spent quite a lot of time looking at some very specific interventions in a number of countries. And so one of them we've looked at is USAID's program in Kenya, which you will know well. And I actually think this is an example of an intervention that's done a pretty good job. Now, it's easier. You know, everyone likes milk. You know, milk is nutrient dense, etc. It tends to have quite a positive, consumers are quite receptive to milk. Yeah, there are issues to do with lactose intolerance, etc. But, you know, you're working with a substance that nutritionists love it, okay? So, you know, you're already over part of the hurdle, okay? What they have done is spend a lot of time, most of their focus has been on producers, okay? On boosting productivity of dairy production, on installing coolers and all this sort of thing, linking farmers through to supply chains, okay? But what they've also done is explore ways in which you can get milk to poor people. Why? Because there are a lot of poor people, and so there's potentially a lot of milk to be sold. They're not particularly, at least when they started out, they weren't particularly interested in nutrition. So these things, it's all about incentives, and the incentives here align really well. Okay, so what have they done? Okay, they've looked at things like school milk programs, into rejuvenated school milk programs, predominantly in rural areas, towards self-help groups like women with HIV/AIDS. They've looked at some social protection mechanisms, direct mechanisms, very easy to basically connect into, relatively cheap to do so, very effective way of getting to relatively small proportion, but a proportion of small consumers. Okay? Of course, part of the problem we still face is, you know, I can remember sitting around a table talking about this, saying, it's really interesting, you know, they've been rejuvenating the school milk program in Kenya, and isn't this great? And the nutritionist said, we're not interested in school children, we're interested in infants under the age of 2. And so you can see again these problems of seeing the world differently. I would have thought it was still a good thing, but they were not convinced. If you could get the kids to take the milk home, that would be fine. Okay, so you can see the challenges. What else have they done? Yeah, a lot of that stuff about behavioural communication. But again, milk's easy. You know, you can have those nice posters that show healthy people that are smiling, you know, and they're drinking their glass of milk and whatever. It's an easy thing to work with, okay? But they've done quite a lot of that. They've done other really interesting things. One of the big problems in Kenya was, you know, particularly in the formal sector, a move to using Tetra Pak and selling it in litre containers and whatever. The poor can't afford that. So what have they done? They've looked at using 200 ml plastic bags, cheap, small quantities. Poor can afford to buy that. And so just packaging and working even with larger companies, that is a way of getting through to poor people. And working with things like hawkers and having milk distributors, etc., making milk available close to where people work, for example, making it available in hospitals, etc. And so this one's a relatively good example, but it really shows the importance of aligning incentives. They want to sell milk. They've got something where, which is good nutritionally. There are poor people. There are a big market. And so actually it's relatively easy to align, but they still face a lot of challenges in rethinking. Because the instant reaction would be, let's get in, Brookside and whatever, the big companies, they'll buy a lot of our milk, it's easy to do, it's cheap, and that's easy, okay? But the world, of course, turns out to be somewhat different. What about some that have struggled? And it's interesting because when you start talking about struggles, people start saying, oh, yeah, well, it depends whether you have a bottom-down or top-up approach. Do you start with consumers and nutrition, or do you start with farmers and what they're producing? What we've tended to find is they all run into exactly the same problem, and it's down to the value chains again. Orange flesh sweet potato, great example. A lot of investment. Donors have loved this one. Because high in vitamin A, you can basically introduce this thing into places where people consume sweet potatoes and where farmers know how to grow them. The trouble is, what happens if they consume white sweet potato that's dryish, and this stuff is a bit sloppy, and it's the wrong colour. It's orange. Okay, then we might get it into products. So we've been doing some work in Mozambique in this, and they've got great ideas of putting orange flesh sweet potato into bread. Golden bread, it's another one of those, brands in development. The biggest problem is, how do you get tubers to bakers? They're not going to peel sweet potatoes. You need intermediaries who are going to produce pulp that is shelf-stable, that bakers can buy, keep in their baking shop, and then integrate into bread. That's far more difficult because you need a whole level of the value chain that doesn't currently exist. The one over here, I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I always get it wrong. This is in Bangladesh. I guess this is an example of the devil and God being in bed with one another, because this is actually, at least in development terms, because this is produced by something called Grameen. So that's, the Grameen Bank and Danone, one of those nasty multinational dairy companies, And they very much got in bed with one another, produced a yogurt, which is basically enriched, very high in calcium and iron, and it has all those nice cultures and sort of things in it. And, it's been relatively successful, but not as successful as they thought. Why? Poor people don't tend to buy yogurt, they tend to produce it in their homes. Maybe far better to give them culture and they can produce it at home. Other problems are, it's shelf-stable, but, like a lot of yogurt, it tends to get a bit liquidy, over time, and people don't tend to like that very much. And they had the idea of people going around households and selling it, women, for example. And, there are a lot of issues to do with social acceptability. Are people used to buying yogurt on their doorstep? Do they trust the person to come around and sell them yogurt, etc.? Exactly the same problems in the value chain. Nice concept, potentially, but again, problems along the value chain. And it's getting everything really tied up and understanding those linkages that are absolutely fundamental. So what are the implications? Obviously agriculture has a key role to play, And probably its biggest role is in prices. Of course, I'm an economist, But reducing real food prices is going to be critical, or at least keeping them down, The poor spend an awful lot of money on food, and this is an absolutely critical issue, even in terms of, and particularly in terms of staples. But they also have a key role in the production of nutrient-dense foods, and ideally domestically rather than importing the stuff. The trouble is we've got to integrate them better. We have to really fundamentally look at how we can get agri-food value chains functioning better, particularly in terms of getting food from non-producers through to consumers, people who don't produce their own food, including producers at the times of the year and for those foods that they actually purchase. The trouble is, there's some fundamental trade-offs in terms of the very practical implementation. So, Who do we target in terms of producers? If you're interested in poverty, you target poor producers. If you're interested in food supply, you don't necessarily target the poorest. You target maybe slightly bigger farmers, more efficient farmers, farmers that are more receptive. Okay? So there is a trade-off there, often, between a poverty alleviation goal and a food supply availability goal that is difficult. The second is, what do you try and get them to grow? What are you going to focus on in terms of your intervention? The stuff that's going to sell, gain the most income, that may be something that's exported, including orange-flesh sweet potato from Kenya. Okay? Or do we want them to produce things that are consumed locally that are highly nutrient dense? But what if farmers make less income in doing so? So how do you square that circle in terms of interventions? What about target markets? What if the farmers make far more money selling for export, and it's far easier than to low-income consumers? Or it's better to sell to high-income consumers because they're easier, they have more money, they're more receptive, and yet they're not nutrient deficient. These are the challenges on the ground where you're asking agricultural interventions to boost farm incomes, to boost farm productivity, but you're also asking them to have nutritional impact. Sometimes, like milk, everything aligns. In other cases, there are a lot of challenges, and you're asking fundamental questions and fundamental trade-offs that interventions often struggle with. Very critical is consumer food-related behaviour. And that's where I think you are seeing agricultural interventions recognising the role of nutrition education, health promotion, etc., that basically almost none of these things work unless you intervene at that level. Kitchen garden stuff, etc., included. You've got to intervene at the level of people to basically make them aware of, not necessarily of nutrients, but of foods and the implications of consuming foods that are more nutrient dense. Institutional change is critical. I mean, USAID, we've sat around the table and there are people from both Washington and then the countries and then nutrition and agriculture. Most of them have never met before, and they're in different worlds, very different worlds, with very different expectations and different objectives. And a need for rigorous impact assessment. I personally don't believe that. I think we're going to move away from a world of randomised control trials. It doesn't mean they're going to disappear, but they're very difficult to implement and at times not conducive with having the biggest development impacts. But how far we move away, we'll see. But it doesn't mean that we don't need to know what works and what doesn't. Okay, I'll leave it there.